If someone had asked Emily whether anything could ruin her perfect wedding day, she might have laughed. The sun was high over the Tennessee hills, the chairs were all white and satin-covered, and her grandfather's ranch looked like something out of a bridal magazine. She had planned every detail for over a year, down to the lavender sprigs tied to each napkin. Her mother was crying before she even walked down the aisle, and her father had been practicing his speech for weeks. But underneath Emily's smile, there was an ache she hadn't talked about. Her brother, Michael, wasn't there. He had passed away 2 years earlier in a hit-and-run accident just miles from this very ranch. Emily had delayed the wedding once already after his death, and it had taken every ounce of strength to finally let herself feel joy again. She was ready to move on, or at least that's what she told herself. But life had its own way of writing chapters no one expected. The music shifted as Emily took her first steps down the makeshift aisle, arm in arm with her dad. Rows of friends and family stood, and phones quietly clicked as they captured the moment. The air was still, except for a soft breeze carrying the scent of hay and roses. Her fiancé, Mark, waited at the altar, smiling, but with tears clearly pooling in his eyes. For a second, Emily felt the urge to stop walking. Her heels sunk slightly into the soft earth, and in that pause, something else caught everyone's attention. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. The music stuttered as the sound operator looked away from the screen toward the field beyond the ceremony space. A figure was moving slowly, clumsily through the tall grass on the edge of the ranch. It wasn't a person, it was a dog, a large, muddy retriever, limping slightly and holding something in its mouth. At first, people chuckled softly, unsure of what to make of the situation. Was it a neighbor's pet, a lost farm dog? Some guests reached for their phones, amused by the interruption. But as the dog came closer, weaving unsteadily between the chairs, the mood shifted. Its coat was soaked and matted, parts of it clinging to its ribs. The animal looked exhausted, as if it had traveled miles through rough terrain. It stopped in the middle of the aisle, just feet from Emily, and dropped the object it had been carrying onto the grass. There was a collective gasp. It wasn't a stick, it wasn't a toy. It was a dirt-stained, cracked photo frame inside it, a picture of a young man in military uniform. Emily's knees buckled slightly. Her father tightened his grip on her arm, steadying her as she stared at the frame. No one moved for a moment. Mark stepped forward, concern etched on his face. Emily crouched down slowly, ignoring the way her dress creased and the grass stained its edges. She reached for the frame with trembling hands. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned it over. There, in black marker on the back of the wood, was her brother's name, Michael J. Hayes. The photo inside was one Emily hadn't seen in years, taken the day he'd come home from his final tour in Afghanistan. A deep silence fell over the gathering. Somewhere behind the altar, a child whimpered, and someone dropped a glass. The dog lay down where he stood, resting his head on his paws, as if finally at peace. Emily looked up at the crowd, eyes wide with disbelief. The officiant stood frozen, holding his book half open, not knowing whether to continue. A few guests whispered, some standing, some unsure if they should approach. Emily sat down in the grass beside the dog, cradling the photo frame to her chest. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, smearing her carefully done makeup. The dog didn't flinch. It looked up at her once, then closed its eyes again, tail twitching faintly. Mark knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder. No one knew what to say. A wedding interrupted by a stray dog was already unusual, but this felt like something bigger. Something unexplainable. Emily pressed her lips together to stop herself from sobbing. Her fingers grazed the rough edge of the frame. She couldn't understand how it had gotten here. Later, some would suggest the dog had found the frame discarded somewhere on the ranch, maybe from an old box of family belongings left in the barn. Others believed it was a coincidence, a strange twist of fate. But Emily knew what she felt in that moment wasn't random. It felt like a message, like her brother had found a way to be present. The ranch had been his favorite place, where they'd played as children and ridden horses every summer. The dog, now resting in the middle of their sacred space, had brought more than a memory. He had brought back a part of her that she thought was lost. Her heart ached, but it also began to open in a way it hadn't in 2 years. She didn't know who the dog belonged to, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Her father cleared his throat, looking at the guests. "We're gonna take a short break," he said, voice trembling. A few people began to rise, unsure of where to go or how to react. The florist's assistant ran for water. Emily remained on the ground, petting the dog, soaked her gently. It was rough and tangled, but underneath was warmth. The dog opened one eye and looked at her again, a faint wheeze in its breath. Someone brought a towel. Another brought a small bowl and filled it from a water bottle. The animal drank slowly, its body shaking with effort. Someone tried to lead it away, but Emily stopped them. "He stays," she said, her voice low but firm. "He came for a reason." Emily's mother approached cautiously, her heels sinking into the lawn. "Sweetheart, do you recognize that photo?" she asked, her voice cracking. Emily nodded silently. "It's the one from his old knitstand," she whispered. "The frame was cracked in the move. We thought we lost it." Her mother knelt beside her, wiping a tear from Emily's cheek. "Do you think," she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Emily just nodded again. The guests now watched from a respectful distance, many wiping their own tears. Some had served in the military, some had lost loved ones, but all of them felt the weight of that moment. This wasn't just an interruption, it was a sign. No one resumed the ceremony right away. Instead, a makeshift circle formed around Emily and the dog. One of the groomsmen offered his jacket to help keep the animal warm. A bridesmaid pulled flowers from her bouquet and laid them next to the frame. Even the officiant sat on the edge of the platform, his book closed in his lap. Mark sat beside Emily, his hand never leaving hers. "We'll wait," he whispered. "As long as you need." Emily looked down at the dog again. "What's your name?" she asked softly, knowing full well he wouldn't answer. Still, the dog thumped his tail once, and that was enough. Enough to feel like someone was listening. As the sun began to shift in the sky, the temperature dropped slightly, and the air took on that late afternoon gold. The dog stirred, lifting its head and letting out a low, raspy bark. A moment later, it stood slowly, its back legs trembling. It nudged the photo frame closer to Emily, then looked toward the woods beyond the ranch fence. Emily followed its gaze. There was nothing there, just trees and wind. But something inside her told her the dog had come from far beyond, maybe from a place where grief softened and love lingered. Her heart beat louder in her ears. She didn't want to let the moment go. But something told her it wasn't over. The guests began murmuring softly, exchanging glances that blended wonder with disbelief. No one could quite understand what had just happened, but they all felt its weight, as if something sacred had passed through them. Emily stood up slowly, still holding the picture frame, and the dog followed her with effort, limping on one leg. She looked at Mark, who gave her a small nod. There was no pressure, no expectation, only presence. The officiant approached gently, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Would you like to continue?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily looked down at the dog, then at her brother's face frozen in time behind cracked glass. "Not yet," she replied. "Not until we know who he is." Her words weren't about the photo, they were about the dog now. This animal had come into her life for a reason she didn't yet understand, and she couldn't just go on pretending it hadn't happened. Emily's aunt approached cautiously, a lifelong animal lover, and knelt beside the dog. "He's old," she said, brushing mud from the fur around his eyes. "And something's not right with his hip." She gently ran her hands along his side and flinched when she found a bump under the skin. "He might have a broken rib," she added, looking up, "but he's not aggressive. He came with purpose." Emily listened but said nothing. Her chest felt tight, as though something unspoken was trying to surface. "He brought Michael's picture," she said again, almost to herself. "He brought him back." Mark sat behind her now, arms wrapped around her waist. The sun began to dip lower, casting a golden halo over the dog's head. For a moment, it felt like Michael was there just out of reach. The dog rested again, curling slightly in the grass as if finally at peace. Emily's mother walked over with a blanket and laid it over the animal's back, careful not to spook him. "He's shaking," she whispered. "He's been out here too long. No collar, no tags. No name, no clue where he had come from. Yet somehow, he had found his way to the most important day of Emily's life, carrying a piece of her past that had nearly destroyed her. A family friend who volunteered at the local shelter offered to check if the dog had a chip. Someone else called the local vet. Emily refused to leave his side. "We're not moving him," she said softly. This is where he needs to be. The ceremony was no longer the focus. The dog had shifted everything. The moment had changed them all. Guests began to settle on the grass, forming a circle of quiet solidarity. Even children, who normally fidgeted and laughed, sat cross-legged and wide-eyed. A few people cried openly now. The florals, the altar, the cake, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the connection, raw and alive, between the girl in white and the wounded creature at her feet. Emily reached for a water bottle and slowly poured it into a bowl. The dog drank again, slower this time. A faint smile crossed her lips. "He reminds me of when we found Scout," she said to her mother, referring to their childhood golden retriever. Scout was the one who used to sleep under Michael's bed every night. Her mother gasped softly, tears returning. The resemblance was uncanny. "Same honey coat, same calm eyes. Do you think it's—" Her mother started, but stopped. The thought felt too heavy. Minutes passed. Someone offered to help clean up, but Emily shook her head. "We're still getting married," she said. Not yet." She looked down at the dog. "You're part of this now." A silence followed, heavy but not painful. More like reverence. Emily's dad stood quietly beside her, not speaking, just resting a hand on her shoulder. Then, from somewhere deep in the dog's throat, a soft whine rose, high-pitched and desperate. Emily turned. He was trying to move again. He stood shakily, took 3 steps toward the altar, and collapsed. The photo frame was still lying in the grass. Emily rushed to his side. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were alert. "He's trying to show us something," she whispered. "He's not done." She didn't know what he meant, or what she even meant. But she trusted him, completely. A young cousin stepped forward and pointed toward the forest. "There's something over there," he said quietly. All heads turned. Beyond the trees, where the dog had first emerged, something glinted in the setting sun. Mark and one of the groomsmen jogged over to investigate. A few minutes later, they returned, carrying a rusted tin box with a military insignia carved into the lid. Emily gasped. It was one of Michael's old ammo boxes, repurposed as a keepsake chest after his funeral. She had placed it in the attic years ago, yet somehow, here it was. Muddy, dented, but unmistakably real. Emily opened it slowly, hands trembling. Inside were dog tags, faded letters, and a baseball cap with Michael's unit patch. The dog looked at it and whimpered again. Tears flooded Emily's eyes as she held up one of the letters. It was addressed to her. She didn't remember it. She looked around at her family, her guests, her husband-to-be. "I never saw this," she whispered. Her voice broke. "This letter. It's in his handwriting." She clutched it to her chest as if it might vanish. No one spoke. The dog crawled forward an inch, resting his head against the box. "You brought this too, didn't you?" she said to him, tears falling freely. "I needed it today." She finally opened the letter. It was short, dated just days before his final deployment. The words were simple. "If I don't make it back, don't stop living. Let yourself be loved." Emily dropped to her knees again. The message hit like thunder. The dog didn't move after that. He simply lay beside her, his mission complete. Emily cradled the letter and frame in her lap, overwhelmed. Around her, the crowd sat in silence, united in the sacredness of what they'd witnessed. Mark knelt beside her and whispered, "You don't have to explain this. We all feel it." She nodded slowly, eyes still on the dog. "He brought Michael home," she said. "He gave me my brother back." The sun dipped behind the hills, bathing the entire scene in a soft, amber glow. It felt like time had stopped, like heaven had opened, just for a moment, to let something through, something broken, something healing. Just as Emily stood to rise, the dog let out a single, heavy breath. It was long, labored, and final. He didn't twitch again. She fell to her knees beside him. "No," she whispered, cradling his head in her arms. Mark crouched beside her, silent. Her mother sobbed openly now. Her father turned away, but Emily didn't let go. "Thank you," she said. "You can rest now." Her voice cracked with grief, but beneath it was something new, peace. She kissed the top of the dog's head. "You were never lost," she said. "You were coming home." Somewhere nearby, a wind chime hanging from an oak branch began to sing. The wedding resumed, not in the way it was planned, but in a way that mattered more. The dog lay wrapped in a quilt near the altar. Flowers lay gently across his side. The vows were said through tears. The guests stood closer now, hands clasped, eyes full of something eternal. Love had shown itself in an impossible way through a broken picture frame and the sacrifice of a nameless dog. Emily's life had been split in two before this day, and after. And as she and Mark walked hand in hand into their new chapter, she whispered to herself, this wasn't an interruption. She looked back once more. It was a rescue. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat on the floor of the old guest room at her parents' ranch, the photo frame resting beside her and the tin box opened in her lap. The blanket the dog had been wrapped in was draped over her shoulders, still carrying the faint scent of wet fur and earth. Every now and then, she reached down and touched the corner of the letter, as if to remind herself it was real. Mark slept lightly on the couch nearby, his dress shirt wrinkled, his tie loose. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was sacred. They both knew something had changed. Emily's phone buzzed with messages from friends and family. Most had simply written, I'll never forget today, but for Emily, it wasn't just a memory. It was a calling she hadn't yet understood. Early in the morning, just before sunrise, she stepped outside barefoot. The air was cool and the grass damp with dew. She walked back to the altar, now quiet and still, the folding chairs damp with overnight condensation. There, under a small cedar tree, lay a patch of disturbed earth, the place where they had buried the dog the night before, wrapped in his quilt and surrounded by flowers. Emily knelt and brushed away a leaf. Someone had placed a small wooden sign that read, You brought him home. She didn't know who had written it, but it made her cry again. The ache in her chest hadn't left, but it was different now, not sharp, just heavy, a reminder. She whispered, Who were you? To the morning sky. The question echoed softly in the stillness. Later that day, Emily drove into town. She still wore her wedding band, but not the makeup or the veil. She wasn't ready to be a bride yet, not after yesterday. She needed answers. She started with the local shelter. A woman named Carla met her at the desk, kind-eyed and middle-aged. Emily explained everything, from the ceremony to the photo, to the dog's final moments. Carla listened without blinking, her hands folded tight. You said no chip, Carla asked. Emily nodded. No collar either, but he was trained. He understood things. He looked at me like he knew exactly who Michael was. Carla frowned. Sometimes we get dogs like that, she said softly. The ones who find people, not the other way around. She typed something on her computer and asked Emily to wait. In our past, Carla returned with a manila folder. Inside were printed pages and intake reports from the last 6 months. This one might be him, she said, pointing to a grainy photo of a golden retriever covered in mud. Someone reported seeing him around Route 27 a few weeks ago, limping, but he ran off when approached. Couldn't be caught. The report listed him as stray, unapproachable, unknown age. Emily stared at the photo. Even blurry, she recognized the eyes. That's him, she whispered. Carla sighed. He's been on the run a while. Probably lost his home, or maybe he didn't have one to begin with. Emily's chest tightened. Then how did he end up with Michael's things? She asked. That box wasn't lost. It was in my attic. Carla didn't have an answer. The mystery only deepened. Emily returned to the ranch and went straight to the attic. She climbed the creaking stairs, flicked on the yellowed bulb, and began searching. Dust motes floated around her as she opened boxes labeled College, Christmas, and Michael. There, in the back corner, was a space where the tin box used to be. It was gone. No sign of it. No footprints. No explanation. She sat on the attic floor, overwhelmed by a strange mix of awe and confusion. Somehow, the dog had found it. Somehow, he had carried it across fields, through woods, maybe even miles of road, all to arrive exactly when she needed him most. Her fingers shook as she traced the dust outline of the missing box. Why me? She whispered, but deep down, she already knew. That night, Emily had a dream. She was back at the altar, wearing her wedding dress, but she was alone. No guests, no flowers, no music. Just the dog, standing by the tree. He wasn't hurt. He looked younger, cleaner, his eyes bright and alert. In the dream, he walked over and dropped the frame at her feet again. Then he turned and stared into the woods. Emily followed his gaze. There, just beyond the trees, stood her brother, Michael, smiling, hand raised. He didn't speak, he didn't move, but his presence filled her chest with heat and light. When she woke up, she was crying, but smiling too. She felt like she had been given something more than a message, a mission. She sat up in bed and whispered, "You brought him to me. Now it's my turn." Emily made a decision. She wouldn't let the moment pass. The dog had come to her carrying pain, memory, and love. And he had died in her arms with trust in his eyes. That meant something. It had too. She contacted Carla again and asked about any other dogs in the shelter who had been found under strange circumstances. Dogs that seemed to be searching, that wouldn't stay put. Dogs that, like him, were looking for someone. Carla hesitated, then said, "We have a few. You should come see them." Emily drove back that afternoon, nervous but determined. The shelter smelled like bleach and hope. She walked past the rows of cages until she reached the back, where Carla stood beside a run holding a thin shepherd mix with one eye. "She won't eat," Carla said. "Keep staring at the gate. Like she's waiting." Emily crouched beside the kennel, looking into the dog's lone eye. It was tired, but focused. "Hey there," she whispered. The dog stood, just barely, and walked slowly to the bars. Their noses almost touched. Something stirred in Emily's chest again, that same ache, that same pull. She didn't question it this time. "I'll take her," she said. Carla blinked. "You sure? She's a hospice case." "Not much time left." Emily nodded. "I wasn't looking for forever. Just for enough." Carla didn't say anything more. She opened the gate. The shepherd stepped out cautiously, her back legs trembling slightly, and leaned gently against Emily's legs. The weight was familiar, not physical, emotional. "Let's get you home," Emily whispered. And just like that, something began again. Emily named her Hope, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. The name felt right in her mouth, like something she was supposed to say. Hope didn't wag her tail often, but she followed Emily everywhere, even into the garden where the dog from the wedding was buried. Emily sat with her often, the two of them staring at the little wooden sign together. "He brought you too, didn't he?" Emily would whisper. "You're part of it." And maybe Hope didn't understand the words, but she seemed to settle whenever Emily spoke them. Her breathing would slow, her eyes would close, and for a moment, they both felt like they belonged to something bigger. Word of what had happened at the wedding began to spread. At first, it was just among family and friends, people sharing the story over coffee, through text messages, on social media. But then a local journalist reached out after seeing a post with a photo of Emily kneeling beside the dog and the frame. "Can we talk?" he asked. Emily hesitated. She didn't want to sensationalize what had felt sacred. But Mark encouraged her gently. "Maybe this is the beginning of something more," he said. So she agreed. The reporter sat with them under the cedar tree where the dog was buried. Emily told him everything, every detail, every tremble, every breath. When the article was published, it was titled, "The Dog Who Brought the Brother Home." It went viral within days. Emails began flooding in, people who had lost loved ones, people who had found dogs in impossible ways, people who simply wanted to say thank you. A woman from Ohio wrote, "I lost my son in Iraq. I've had a dog sleep at the foot of his bed every night since. I think your story gave me permission to believe in signs." A man in Montana said he buried his brother's medals years ago and never cried until reading her story. But more than that, shelters began reporting an increase in people asking to adopt older dogs. The ones who've already lived a life, someone had posted, the ones with something to say. Emily cried reading those messages. She printed each one and placed them inside Michael's tin box. She felt like he was still speaking, still guiding her. But the path ahead wasn't all peace. There were skeptics too. People who accused her of making it all up, that the photo was planted, that the box had been moved on purpose. Some PR stunt, one person posted. Convenient timing for a wedding. Those words stung more than Emily expected. She knew the truth. She felt it. But suddenly, she was questioning herself. Was grief clouding her memory? Had the pain made her see things that weren't there? Mark saw the shift in her and pulled her close one night. "The people who were there know," he whispered. "I know." And he knew. That's all that matters. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't need to prove it to anyone. But she wouldn't stay silent either. Not if this story could keep touching lives. She wrote a post of her own. not to argue, just to remember. She shared the story again in her words, without drama or embellishment. "A dog came to my wedding," she wrote. "He carried a photo of my brother, and in doing so, he carried me out of the darkest part of my grief. I didn't rescue him. He rescued me." The post exploded. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments, people sending photos of their rescue dogs with tags like #HeBroughtMeTo and #Signs of Love. A community began to form, one built not on proof, but on connection. Emily didn't expect it. She didn't ask for it, but she welcomed it. Because she understood now grief needed space, and sometimes it walked on for legs. Hope grew weaker over the weeks, as Carla had warned. She moved slower, ate less, and sometimes stood at the fence for hours, staring into the trees like she was waiting for someone. Emily stayed close, never letting her feel alone. The day Hope stopped eating completely, Emily called the vet. "Don't come yet," she said softly. "Just tell me what to watch for." That night, Hope whimpered in her sleep, and Emily lay beside her on the floor, wrapped in the same quilt they'd used for the dog at the wedding. She whispered stories, sang lullabies, read the letter from Michael aloud. "He said not to stop living," she told Hope, "so I'm going to keep going. But only because of you." In the early hours of morning, Hope passed quietly. Emily knew the moment she stopped breathing, not from sound, but from stillness. The room didn't feel empty, it felt full, as if Hope had joined something larger. Emily stroked her head gently, tears falling silently. "You made it," she whispered. "You found your way." This time, she didn't bury her alone. Volunteers from the shelter came. Mark helped carry her gently to the garden. They laid her next to the cedar tree, beside the dog who had started it all. They added another wooden sign, this one reading, "She carried hope." Now she rests. Emily stood between the two graves, hands clasped, heart aching but stronger. She didn't know what would come next, only that it wouldn't be ordinary. The connection she had felt wasn't just with one dog, it was with a purpose, a path. She and Mark began volunteering more often at the shelter, helping with older dogs, hospice fosters, and animals no one else wanted. Carla often said, "These dogs don't need saving. They need witnessing." Emily understood that now. Some animals arrived carrying grief, others carrying memories. Some simply carried love with no explanation at all. Emily welcomed them. Not all stayed long. Not all had stories. But each time, Emily whispered the same words, "You're safe. You're seen. You're home." Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It had no return address, just her name. Inside was a photo, a Polaroid of the dog from the wedding, sitting outside what looked like an old house. On the back were 5 words, "He belonged to my brother." Emily's hands shook as she read them. That meant someone else had known him, that he had once had a life, a name, a place. She stared at the photo, memorizing every blade of grass, every beam of wood in the house. She would find it. She had to. Because maybe this story wasn't over, maybe it was just beginning. She sat at the kitchen table with Mark, the photo between them. "Do you think I'm crazy?" she asked softly. Mark smiled. "No, I think you've been chosen." Emily nodded slowly. That word used to scare her, but now it felt right. Chosen didn't mean special, it meant responsible. Responsible to carry forward what had been given to her, to honor the journey of a dog who carried grief in his mouth and love in his heart. Emily folded the photo and tucked it inside Michael's box. She didn't know where the next step would lead, but she was ready to take it. Because some stories, once opened, don't ever really end. They just keep walking beside you. The morning after receiving the anonymous letter, Emily couldn't focus on anything else. Her coffee went cold untouched, and she stared at the photo for over an hour, tracing the edges with her finger like a trail she needed to follow. The image showed the retriever sitting on a weathered porch, surrounded by fall leaves. A chipped mailbox with the number 183 was barely visible, and in the window behind him hung an American flag, faded but proud. Emily's breath caught as she studied the small details. She had no name, no town, no map, just that number and a feeling. Mark sat across from her, watching silently. "You're going to look for it, aren't you?" he finally said. Emily nodded. "I don't know where it is, but I have to find it." The weight in her chest felt like urgency, not burden. She couldn't explain it, but she didn't have to. Emily started by posting the photo on a community board connected to military families and veterans. She asked a simple question: does anyone recognize this house or this dog? Within hours, her inbox began filling with replies, some leads, some guesses, some hopeful notes from strangers moved by the story. One message stood out. A woman named Rachel said her uncle had lived in a house just like that in rural Kentucky before he passed. He had a retriever named Buddy, Rachel wrote. After Uncle Joe died, Buddy disappeared. We thought he ran off to die somewhere. We never found him. Emily's chest tightened. Could it be him? She messaged Rachel, who sent more photos. Buddy as a pup, sitting in front of that same porch. The mailbox, the flag, it matched. Every detail was there. Her hands shook. Rachel gave her the address, 183 Larkspur Lane, just outside a town called Ash Hollow. It was 6 hours away. Emily didn't hesitate. She packed a small bag, grabbed Michael's box, and printed out the wedding photo, the one where she knelt beside the dog with the frame in his mouth. You really want to do this? Mark asked as they loaded the car. Emily looked at him with clear, quiet certainty. He crossed miles to bring me something. The least I can do is return the favor. They drove through winding roads and quiet highways, passing fields and old barns, the hum of the tires grounding them in the present. Neither spoke much. There wasn't a need. They arrived in Ash Hollow just before sunset, the town bathed in golden light. The house was still there, aged and quiet, nestled under tall trees and surrounded by open land. No one lived there now. Rachel had said it was left empty after her uncle's passing. Emily stepped out of the car and approached slowly, her heart thudding. It was surreal to see it in person after studying the photo for so long. The porch creaked under her weight, and the chipped mailbox 183 stood untouched. She placed a hand on the wooden railing, worn smooth by time. This is it, she whispered. The place felt heavy with memories, as if the air itself remembered the man and the dog who once sat there. Emily sat on the steps and pulled out the frame, holding it up to the fading light. You brought him here, she said to no one. She and Mark spent the evening cleaning the front porch and trimming back some overgrown ivy. It felt right, respectful. Emily placed the frame on the windowsill and sat back down. Mark joined her, handing her a cup of tea. You think he was trying to come home? He asked. Emily nodded. I think he was trying to finish something. The wind picked up slightly, and for a moment, Emily swore she heard a faint bark in the distance just once, like an echo. She didn't say anything, just closed her eyes and let herself feel the weight of it all. Later, they camped inside the house, laying sleeping bags in the front room. It was dusty, but peaceful. That night, Emily dreamed of Buddy running, his legs strong, his eyes bright, his journey complete. The next morning, Emily stood in the yard, barefoot in dew-covered grass. She turned toward the edge of the property, where an old tree stood alone, its branches low and twisted. Something drew her there. Beneath the tree, she found a small wooden marker, half buried in soil and moss. The name Joe was carved into it. It wasn't a grave, just a memory spot, maybe. She knelt and brushed away the moss. Next to it, barely visible, was a second marker. Buddy. Her breath caught. This was their place. Somehow, the dog had remembered, even after everything. Emily pulled the quilt from her bag, the same one from the wedding and Hope's passing. She laid it down gently between the two markers. You came back, she whispered. You finished the story. They stayed in Ash Hollow for 2 more days. Emily cleaned the markers, cleared the weeds, and placed fresh wildflowers by each name. The townspeople stopped by when they heard she was visiting. Some had stories about Joe and his dog, how they used to sit on that porch every evening, how Buddy would follow Joe to the mailbox every morning without fail. That dog was his heart, one older woman said. When Joe died, Buddy wouldn't eat for days. Emily listened, absorbing every detail. He remembered all of it, she murmured. Even after all those miles. One man gave her an old photo of Joe and Buddy together. Emily added it to Michael's box, to lives, to journeys, and now somehow, forever connected. The night before they left, Emily stood by the markers again. She had brought the photo frame and the letter from Michael, placing both gently between the stones. You helped me find my brother, she said to Buddy's memory. And now I helped you come home. Mark stood beside her in silence. Fireflies flickered in the dark, and somewhere an owl called from the trees. Emily felt something close a circle, a thread, maybe even a purpose tie itself into a knot and rest. Her grief hadn't vanished. Her heart still ached, but now it had shape. Now it had direction. She would carry this story with her, not just the pain, but the healing. When they returned to the ranch, everything looked different. Not because the trees or buildings had changed, but because she had. Emily walked through the gate and paused, staring out at the field where the dog had first appeared. She could almost see him again, muddy, limping, determined. A piece of something bigger, walking toward her with a message only she could understand. She whispered, "I got him home." And just like that, the wind picked up, soft and full. She didn't cry, she just smiled, because healing doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in fur and breath and purpose. And sometimes it leaves behind a path for others to follow. Life at the ranch gradually returned to a gentle rhythm, but something in Emily had fundamentally shifted. She couldn't unsee what she had experienced, couldn't unknow the power of a single animal's journey to heal and connect lives. The garden behind the barn, once used for vegetables, became a sanctuary. Emily transformed it into a memorial space, not just for Buddy or Hope, but for all animals who had carried love across impossible distances. She planted lavender and rosemary along the path, the same scents that had filled the air on her wedding day. Wine chimes hung from low branches, each one engraved with a name. Visitors began stopping by. At first it was family, then strangers, then veterans. They left collars, photos, dog tags, poems. No signs marked the space, but everyone knew what it was, a place to remember what love carries. Mark watched Emily move through this new chapter with quiet awe. She wasn't just grieving anymore, she was building. "I feel like I'm living with someone who hears things the rest of us can't," he once said, only half joking. Emily just smiled. She didn't hear ghosts. She heard stories, ones that still had something to give. She started speaking at local shelters, sharing the wedding story, then Buddy's, then Hope's. Her talks weren't dramatic or rehearsed. She spoke plainly, from the heart. "Sometimes we think we find these animals," she told one audience, "but the truth is they've been looking for us all along." People cried. People adopted. One woman adopted 3 senior dogs in one day. "Because I want to be part of something that mattered," she said. Eventually, a national nonprofit reached out. They wanted to partner with Emily to launch a program for matching hospice dogs with veterans and families in grief. Emily hesitated. She wasn't a professional. She wasn't a therapist, but she had lived something no curriculum could teach. "I don't have the credentials," she told the director. "You have the experience," the woman replied. "That's rarer." And so began the Carry Home Project, a network connecting older dogs with people who had experienced profound loss. Emily worked with vets, volunteers, and foster homes to build a process rooted in empathy, not efficiency. Dogs who were often overlooked were now honored. Each one was matched with someone who needed a companion that didn't ask for much, just to be near. The project gained momentum. Articles were written, interviews recorded. But Emily kept her feet on the ground. She still visited the garden daily, still whispered the names aloud, still thanked the dog who started it all. One evening, she received a letter from a man in Oregon. He was a widower who had adopted a 13-year-old Labrador named Pearl. "I thought I was too old to heal," he wrote. "But she didn't care how old I was, she just sat with me. And I found myself breathing again." Emily folded the letter and placed it beside Michael's. "They're all carrying something," she said aloud. "And now, so am I." That weight no longer felt heavy. It felt necessary, like a torch passed, not a burden carried. Emily and Mark welcomed their first child a year later. They named him Jonah Michael. On the day they brought him home, Mark carried the baby through the garden, stopping at each chime. Emily followed with quiet tears. "He'll grow up knowing these stories," she said. "Not just his uncles, all of them," Mark nodded. "And maybe someday, he'll find his own dog." The thought made her heart swell. Not with fear, but with hope, because now she knew some animals don't just come into your life. They arrive when something in you needs mending. And if you're open, if you're still enough, you'll see what they bring. Not long after Jonah was born, Emily received another letter, this one from a VA hospital in Texas. A former soldier had adopted a deaf spaniel named Murphy through the Carry Home Project. I hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, the man wrote. But when Murphy came, I started talking again. Not to people, just to him, but it was a start. Emily read it 3 times before placing it gently in the box. Every story added to the tapestry. Every bond reminded her that love doesn't need sound or language to move mountains. Sometimes, all it needs is breath, presence, and a place to rest. The photo from the wedding, the one with the dog carrying the frame, was framed again, this time in oak. It hung in the hallway of the ranch house where every guest would pass. Underneath, a small brass plate read, "He didn't just bring a picture. He brought her back." Visitors often stopped to stare. Some cried. Some asked questions. And Emily would always answer with the same words. He knew where to go. I just had to listen. There was no shrine, no altar, just truth. And truth, she had learned, didn't need to be loud to last. It just needed to be felt. On Jonah's first birthday, Emily brought him to the cedar tree. She held him close, kissed his forehead, and sat on the quilt now weathered by time. "You won't remember this," she said softly, "but this is where everything changed." Jonah babbled and reached for the wind chime above them. It swayed, sang, shimmered. Emily smiled. That sound. That's the sound of being found. She didn't know what path her son would walk, but she prayed he would always know that love, even when broken, has direction. And sometimes, it walks toward you on muddy paws, carrying a piece of what you lost and what you needed to find again. That night, Emily lit a single candle in the kitchen and placed it beside Michael's box. She looked at the letters, the photos, the tags, the folded quilt. It had all begun with grief, but it hadn't stayed there. It had stretched outward, reached across miles, touched strangers, saved lives. She thought of Buddy, of Hope, of Murphy and Pearl, and all the dogs that had come and gone since. "You didn't just carry pain," she whispered. "You carried meaning. And meaning, once delivered, doesn't go away. It lingers, it grows, it teaches, and it brings people home." The ranch had changed, though the buildings were the same and the hills still rolled endlessly under the Tennessee sky. What shifted was something invisible woven into the routines, the quiet moments, the way people arrived and left with lighter hearts. The garden, once a private gesture, had become a quiet pilgrimage site. Veterans came, some alone, some holding trembling hands. Widows, children, people who had buried too much. They sat beneath the cedar tree, tracing the chimes with their fingers, speaking softly to no one in particular. Emily greeted each one, not as a host, not as a founder, but as someone who understood. She never asked them to explain their pain. She just gave them space to breathe next to it. Because healing, she had learned, starts with being allowed to feel. Inside the ranch house, a corkboard near the front door overflowed with snapshots, photos of dogs and people, together in moments of silent redemption. Some were playful, some were still, some showed final moments, where goodbye was said with grace. Emily knew every name. She kept a log, not for records, but for reverence. The project had grown beyond anything she imagined. The Carry Home project now had chapters in 6 states, with more forming every season. Each one followed the same quiet philosophy, not rescue, but reunion, not ownership, but companionship. The idea that a soul could arrive in fur, carrying love too big to leave behind. And the belief that no goodbye is final, not if someone remembers your name. Jonah grew up learning to read by sounding out names from collar tags. Every bedtime story ended with "Tell me about Buddy again." Emily never tired of it. She told him about a dog who crossed fields with a frame in his mouth. About a brother who had once held her hand in summer light. About a letter that taught her how to live again. One day, she showed him the wedding photo. Jonah, just for, asked, "Why did he bring that picture?" Emily smiled, brushing back his curls. "Because I forgot to bring my heart," she said. "And he brought it back to me." The boy stared at the photo for a long time, then whispered, "That's what dogs do." And somehow, he already understood. Emily's story was invited onto stages and into books, but she never sought fame. She declined morning shows and turned down film rights. What mattered wasn't spotlight, it was continuation. "Let the story keep walking," she told one producer. Not performing, she gave talks in barns, school gyms, and backyards, where people sat on folding chairs and cried quietly into sleeves. She brought Michael's letter everywhere, read it aloud. Every time, people cried hardest at the same line, "Let yourself be loved." That sentence had saved her. And now, it saved others. A woman in Kansas kept it taped to her refrigerator. A widower in Florida tattooed it on his forearm. Emily didn't ask for that kind of impact, but she honored it, every single time. The cedar tree became the heart of the property. New wine chimes were added each season, gifts from people who had found their own carriers, dogs who had walked with them through illness, death, addiction, war. Emily remembered them all. She lit candles on the anniversaries. Mark joined her sometimes, other times she went alone, speaking their names into the wind like a prayer. One year, Jonah helped her hang a chime shaped like a dog's paw. "Who's this one for?" he asked. "For the ones we never met," she replied, "but who still mattered." They stood together in the hush of twilight, listening as the breeze turned memory into melody. It wasn't silence, it was understanding. One summer, a woman arrived unannounced. She carried a small urn and a leash with no collar. Emily met her at the gate, no questions asked. The woman just said, "He found me when I couldn't get off the floor. I want him to rest somewhere full of meaning." Emily led her to the garden. Together, they knelt under a fig tree, no speech, just presence. That afternoon, Emily added another chime. Later, she updated the logbook. The dog's name was Finn. The woman's name was Teresa. That was all that needed to be said, because the story wasn't about what they lost. It was about what had been given before the goodbye. Mark sometimes wondered aloud how different their life would have been if the dog had never interrupted their wedding. Emily never answered, she just looked out at the land. She knew the answer wasn't simple. If Buddy hadn't appeared, she might have kept walking with half a heart. Might have married, smiled, mothered, but without truly being present. Grief does that, it teaches you how to fake it. But that dog didn't let her fake anything. He made her stop. He made her see. And in doing so, he gave her back to herself. No guest list could have accounted for that kind of arrival. But his name was written in every chapter since. When Jonah turned 7, he wrote a letter of his own. It said, "Dear dog who helped my mom, thank you. I love animals too. I think you are still around, even if we can't see you." Emily read it aloud to the garden, voice shaking. She didn't correct his grammar. She didn't change a word. Because sometimes, a child tells the truth better than any grown-up ever could. That night, she placed the letter inside Michael's box, next to the first one. 2 voices, 2 brothers, one carried by blood. One carried by paws, both carried her. Years passed, and the project only deepened. More homes were opened, more dogs were honored. Volunteers came from all walks: nurses, soldiers, teenagers, retired farmers. Some had never owned a pet, others had said goodbye to more than they could bear. They all shared one belief: love arrives in strange forms. And once it demands action. Emily no longer led the project alone. She mentored others, shared the work, trusted the next hands. But every big decision still passed through her heart, not because she needed control, but because she remembered how it started: mud on white satin, and a gaze that said, "You are not alone." In the quietest moments, when the house was dark and the world asleep, Emily would return to the garden alone. She'd sit cross-legged under the cedar, quilt around her shoulders, and simply listen. Sometimes the chimes didn't move at all. Other nights, they danced. She never asked for a sign. But when they came, she said thank you, for Buddy, for Hope, for Michael, for every soul who arrived carrying something heavier than anyone could see. And for the ones who stayed, even when they had every reason to run. The final chime was added one October morning, years later, when Emily's hair had streaks of silver and Jonah was old enough to drive. It was engraved with the words, "He didn't just save a dog, he found himself." Jonah hung it himself, while Emily held the ladder steady. It caught the wind immediately, a soft, warm sound, like laughter between leaves. They stood beneath it a while, neither speaking. Then Jonah said, "Mom, what should I do if I ever hear crying in the woods?" Emily turned slowly, looked him in the eyes, and smiled. "You go toward it," she said. "And you listen, because that's how it all began, and that's how it keeps going."